Hello, Journey family and friends. It's Pastor John with you again today on Midweek Conversations. So good to have you join us today. I hope you were able to join us this past Sunday as my friend from my Bible college days, Pastor Dave Stone, spoke at Journey. And we're just so grateful that Dave shared. I'm sure you were encouraged by his message. If you didn't get a chance to see his message, I encourage you to go back to the Journey website, go to our YouTube channel, go to the app and watch the message. Dave and I, as I shared in the video introducing Dave, I've known Dave since 1980. He was a sophomore, I was a freshman. He was a roommate, or not a roommate, his college dorm room was right next to mine. So got to know Dave very well. He's had a wonderful ministry, primarily at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. He does a lot of traveling, does a lot of speaking now, he's a writer, and we were just really blessed to have him with us. So I encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to see his message, to check that out. Well, you know, one of the things I love about Journey and have loved about Journey since I first visited here, even when I was not the pastor, I visited Journey in September, I believe it was, of 2009, just kind of checking things out. Nobody knew who I was, but I was struck immediately by the diversity, by the multiracial diversity that I saw at Journey. And that really spoke to me. It was compelling to me because I've predominantly pastored almost all white churches in the past. And I had a heart to want to reach people of every color. And I believe that the church on earth should look like the church in heaven. And we read in the book of Revelation that from every tribe and every tongue and every nation, people are praising God before the throne. And if that's how heaven's going to look, I think that's what the church ought to look like. So it's been an intentional focus of mine over these last 12 years to build a multiracial, multi-ethnic congregation. And over the past 12 years, we've seen even more evidence that has happened, and I'm very grateful for that. But as always, there are challenges that can happen when we, specifically, when we have honest conversations about race. These conversations are still very much a part of our daily life as citizens of the U.S., but also many places around the world. There's a struggle with the residual effects of racism in many, many places. And so one of the things that I try to do is I try to understand this. I try to understand it from a gospel perspective, from a biblical perspective. And what does the gospel have to say about this? And so I've read several books on this topic. And I sat down recently with an author who wrote a couple of books on this topic, but I'll get to that in just a moment. Let me introduce who I sat down with recently and had a conversation with that we're going to show you here in just a moment. After graduating West Texas State University with a Bachelor of Science in Economics, Dr. George Yancey attended the University of Texas at Austin. He received his doctorate in sociology in 1995. He first began to study interracial romance. He wrote a book several years ago titled Just Don't Marry One, about interracial dating relationships and marriages, and particularly what does the Bible say about this? When my oldest daughter started dating her now husband, who is from Ghana, a black man, she gave me this book to read. And she said, "Dad, I think this would help you." So that's the first time I ran across Dr. Yancey. Dr. Yancey then began to work with Dr. Michael Emerson on a grant to study multiracial churches. He also began to study, this is very interesting, academic bias, and has conducted research on anti-Christian attitudes in the United States. And that resulted in some of his latest writings entitled Hostile Environment, Understanding and Responding to Anti-Christian Bias. And here's an interesting title of one of his books, So Many Christians, So Few Lions, that explores the idea of Christianophobia, a fear of Christians here in America. He's taught at the University of North Texas. And then in 2019, he started working for Baylor University with a joint appointment in sociology and the Institute of Religious Studies at Baylor. He has several videos on YouTube. He's a contributor to the Gospel Coalition and other evangelical content outlets. But I wanted to talk with Dr. Yancey about his two books on racial reconciliation. One is titled Beyond Racial Gridlock. That came out in 2006, so about 14 years or 16 years ago. And his latest book, that won't be released until March of 2022, is titled Beyond Racial Division. And Dr. Yancey says, and I agree, that the local church should be the safest place to have the most difficult conversations. And some of those difficult conversations have to do with race and how people see that differently and what we should do about that. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. It's the first time I'd ever talked with Dr. Yancey. I'd not known him before. I just reached out to him, asked him to join us in Midweek Conversations, and he agreed to do that. So I hope you find this conversation helpful. And at the end, I'll come back and wrap up. And Dr. Yancey, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Yancey, you've written a lot about some very relevant discussions. At least I think they should be relevant discussions that we're having in the church today. I told you when I first contacted you, the first book that I came and became aware of that you wrote was called Just Don't Marry One, which was about interracial dating, biblically speaking. How do we understand that? And my oldest daughter gave me a copy of that book when she started dating the man that became her husband, and that was really, really helpful. And then I ran across a review of your book from 2006, Beyond Racial Gridlock, that was recommended. I read it. I so enjoyed it. But now I understand you're coming out with a second book. So I wanted to give you just explain to us the first book and then the need for the second book.
Yeah. So the first book was written in 2006 or 2007, one or the other. And basically, I outlined what I thought was a Christian approach towards dealing with racial issues, which, was to recognize our human depravity, our need to come to one another. That book is now 16 years old. So I felt there was a need to update that. Some things I've learned actually helped me become more humble in my approach. I still believe in the notion that we need to have what I call collaborative conversations with one another, goal-oriented conversations, to recognize that none of us have all the answers. Our human depravity robs us of the ability to objectively think through some of this stuff. We seek out answers that feed us and our people and not that feed everybody. So working together to build community instead of polarization. So I felt that there was value in not just updating that book, but going a little bit beyond where that book could go.
One of the things that you said in the book was the way we define a social problem will affect the way we conceive of its solution. If we have an incomplete definition of a problem, then we will envision a limited solution. Tell me a little bit about, explain that a little bit more.
Well, one of the issues is that people look at the problems of race in our society and they define a certain way, which leads to a certain solution. So if you define the problem of racism, that we pay attention to race at all, then your solution is going to be, let's not pay attention to race. Yeah, right. You define the problem is whites are uniquely in the wrong, and thus they have to be controlled. That becomes your solution. Yeah. So the solution, the way we look at our problems going to define how we're going to solve the problem. I see the problem as our fallen human nature and how sin has come into the world. And the way in which you have to deal with it then is to recognize how sin impacts not other people, but also me as well. Right. And so the solution is going to be, how can I approach this? How can we all approach this where we recognize our fallen nature, and thus how we can find solutions that can somehow overcome that fallen nature to some degree?
In your first book, you talked about four different secular approaches to the problem of racism. I see, even though your second book hasn't been released yet, I read just a little bit of what I could from Amazon, the introduction to Beyond Racial Division. And you kind of took those four approaches and put them into two. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, this is part of the difference between the book had been written in 2006 to today. I feel that the four models that I wrote about were very relevant, all four of them in 2006. I think really only two of them have really survived and to be really strong today. And those two are colorblindness and white responsibility.
Could you briefly tell us what the four were and then what the two are now that you see?
Sure. The first was colorblindness, the notion that we just ignore race and that's going to solve our problems. Second was angle conformity, that if people of color begin to act like whites, they can succeed as well as whites would, and that would solve the problems. Third is multiculturalism, that we got to find a way to honor all cultures, and in doing that, we'll solve the problems. And the fourth was white responsibility, which today I call anti-racism, which is that whites are the problem, and thus we got to fix whites if we're going to fix this problem.
And so those are kind of two. So in your new book, you kind of collapse that into those two categories of colorblindness and anti-racism.
Yes.
And those would be kind of the polar extremes, so to speak, in approaching the problem from a secular viewpoint.
I would say it's this way. They both have qualitatively different ways of looking at the problem and solving the problem. I actually say that they are similar in that both basically come at it this way. If you follow our insights, we solve the problems. We know how to solve the problems. You, whoever that you are, need to listen to us and help us solve the problems. So in that way, they're similar. Now, the actual insight, what they want to solve the problem is dramatically different. But that approach of we are the answers and you need to follow our answers, that's actually pretty similar.
Okay, very, very good. I thought it was interesting as I was just kind of going through some of your notes and some of your articles. Dr. Yancey's written extensively on a lot of different topics, but some of the articles that I read as well, that the collaborative conversations, as you call it, and in the model that you propose that addresses racism from a more gospel-centered approach is you call mutual accountability. Talk to us about both of those.
Yeah, so mutual accountability is, in club conversations, I kind of put them, I pretty much interchange those concepts. So that, sometimes talk about club conversations, because I think sometimes it's more innately, it describes itself a little bit easier than mutual accountability.
Right.
I use the term mutual accountability because my argument is that everyone has the responsibility. Everyone's accountable for creating an atmosphere where we could have a collaborative conversation, where we could have a productive conversation. Our solutions may not be mutual, but the responsibility of having a conversation where we're willing to listen to others and learn how to communicate with others, that transcends race. So in that sense, I'm saying everyone has that responsibility. And then the conversation is part of what I think we should head towards. That's why I interchange them.
I noticed that you had mentioned in your latest book, which I thought was so accurate in your analysis, that there's an unhealthy cycle of racial controversy that takes place in the United States. And you term it like this: there's a racial incident, such as a police shooting of an African American, and then we have a series of protests demanding justice. After a while, there are counter-protests and pushback from those who consider the demands of the protester to be unreasonable. And finally, we return to some kind of normalcy and wait for the next racial incident to start the cycle all over again. Obviously, I think that is so accurate, and yet, as you quote, I believe it's Albert Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. How can we apply what you are advocating in your writings to get beyond that cycle?
Sure. So we have to interrupt the cycle, or else it's going to go again and again. And I think the time to interrupt the cycle is with the next racial incident. Then instead of going to a protest, counter protest, let's try to figure out how we can talk through this incident, what we can learn from it, what we can change, but change in a way where we're not just fighting each other. What's happening is one side wants certain changes, so they're fighting for those changes, and they're going to put down anyone who resists. The other side wants changes, and they're going to fight. Instead of just fighting and trying to keep each other down, can we work together so that we can either minimize the chances of that racial incident happening again, or if it happens again, we know what we want to get out of it. So it doesn't become the cycle of hostility and acrimony towards one another. So that's the time in which we can interrupt it. We can interrupt it if we're willing to come together, build community, not polarization, and work our way through these incidents.
One of the things that I appreciated, and this drawing more on your book from 2006, Beyond Racial Gridlock, is your view of the gospel and beginning with the sin nature that we all have, regardless of color. There is an inherent selfishness, sin nature, human depravity that we all have. And as I've read a lot of books on this topic from a secular viewpoint. That is what is missing, is that common component that we're all sinful. Just assuming your own faith and your own background has helped you form that, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just looking at one of the quotes you have: the root of racial strife is not overemphasis on race, material inequity, the dominance of European American culture, or the racism of majority group members. Those factors are significant, but ultimately our racial problems come from the sin nature that has invaded our souls.
Yeah, I stand by that. I mean, that's the ultimate. The other things are symptoms of that problem, and you have to deal with the symptoms. Obviously, you're sick, you got to deal with your fever, but you got to also deal with the problem.
One of the things in my conversations with people about race, and particularly with people who look like me, white people, is there's a willingness to acknowledge individual racism, but there's a bigger struggle to see structural or systematic racism, and I think that's a huge talking point from people who have these different views. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so here's one of the things. The way racism looks today is not the way it used to look. So, and that gets people confused when you use the word racism. Are you meaning overt racism? And when people talk about structural racism, what they're really talking about is the ways our institutions unfairly impact people of color. And there's a lot of examples. There's a lot of research on how this, our criminal justice system. We know that all things being equal, that people of color, especially African Americans and Hispanic Americans, are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted, serve longer sentences. We know that our residential segregation has had pernicious long-term effects on the lives of people of color. We know that there's occupational discrimination, and not always intentional. It's not always intentional, but the research is out there and it's pretty strong. So this sort of institutional type of discrimination does not require people to have racial hatred. But it's just the reality that in our society, because of the way it's set up, people of color are at a disadvantage in our society. And that's what makes the whole notion of colorblindness very difficult, because colorblindness only makes sense if we have a totally fair society. Then we can say, let's just ignore this and move on. Right? Yeah. But if society is not fair, then what you do is you're ignoring problems and you're ignoring unfair things happening. And that's why colorblindness fails, is because it tries to say that we have a totally fair society, and yet we have all this research and the experiences of people of color that show that we don't.
One of the things that you said in the book is sin is not limited to individualistic actions. sin is a personal action that has societal implications. And the way I understand the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of depravity is not only was a curse put upon man when Adam and Eve sinned, but all the systems of the world, the creation. So how could there? I don't know how there could be individual sin and yet there'd be clean, untainted systems, because those systems are ultimately managed by sinful people.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that sometimes American Christians focus too much on the individual sin, which, yeah, individual sin we should definitely pay attention to.
Yeah.
But not also recognize that individual sin is connected to larger social structures. And what we humans do, that sin passes on into these structures.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that you talked about was just looking at Jesus, and the statement from John chapter 4, verse 4. You said Jesus is the ultimate reconciler, and I say amen to that. But you said when Jesus had to go through Samaria on his way from Judea to Galilee, he was making a political statement. What do you mean by that?
Well, and I'm not a theologian and I'm not studying biblical history, but this is what I was taught. That at that time, most Jews avoided Samaria. Even though it was kind of closer to go through Samaria to go to where you want to go, most Jews avoided it because the Samaritans, the history of the Samaritans, of course, was that I believe, if I remember correctly, they were a group that was placed within the Jewish culture when they were conquered by, I believe, Babylon. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm a sociologist, I'm not a theologian. But there was a lot of ethnic hatred that was there.
Yes.
That's the main point. There was a lot of ethnic hatred. They were planted there and they were seen as resentment. So Jews avoided them. So Jesus going through Samaria was an intentional act, because the tradition was you went around Samaria.
Yeah.
To go through Samaria was an intentional act. And that's what I mean that Jesus intentionally went through Samaria. He's making a political statement.
Well, and you said following that, from the very beginning, Jesus was signaling that we must overcome our prejudices toward others if we're going to be part of his movement. And I liked you talked about, first of all, as a Jew talking to the Samaritan woman and that interaction, and how he asked her for water, for help, and shared with her as an image bearer. And yet at the same time, Jesus was oppressed ethnically by the Romans, and how he related to the Romans. He healed the centurion's servant. He welcomed people to come from him from all backgrounds. Talk to us a little bit about the posture of both of those.
Yeah. So Jesus recognizes our full humanity, the fallen nature of it, but the fact that, we're God's creatures. And in both situations, he's doing that. He confronted the Samaritan woman on her sins. He didn't sort of deify the Samaritan woman. She wasn't perfect. He confronted her on her sins, but he cared about her. And so when he went there, he ministered to her. And if he had gone around Samaria, he would have never had just ministered to her, because she wouldn't have been there. He also cared, as you say, about the Romans, who at that day and time were oppressing the Jewish people. And so he would heal them. He ministered to them. Our posture as Christians is that we should care for everyone. We should care for those who society sees as below us and those society sees as above us. That doesn't mean that we don't speak out against injustices. The story of the adulteress who was caught. Jesus spoke out against the injustice of these men who are going to stone her, and yet we're guilty of sin as well. So it's not that we don't speak out against injustice, but we have to do it in a way that's, I think, productive as an academic, but as a Christian, is edifying. And one thing I tell my friends who are very strong into issues of justice is that you can be totally right in what you're saying and totally in sin in how you say it, how you approach it.
Wow.
So, there's you can't say, well, I'm right, therefore I can treat you as less than.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true for everyone. I think if we Christians have that sort of attitude, it would change the way we deal with race, and the world would notice that we're dealing with race in a way that's better than how the rest of the world's dealing with race.
I think that's so key, and you talk about that, the role of the church, and particularly a multi-ethnic church, multiracial church. N.T. Wright, one of my favorite New Testament scholars, Tom Wright, said that the church was the first multi-ethnic community in the world. And I never had thought about that before, but talk to us a little bit about how does the church, and there are two things that you said that become very important for conversations, is multi-ethnic church and interracial marriages. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So one of the things I did as a scholar is I looked at situations that were racially mixed, they were voluntary, such as families and churches, and I looked for why they were successful. And so, I have another book out, One Body, One Spirit, that really, as a Christian book, talks about how do you create a multiracial church setting.
Yeah.
The things that matter in these situations is having leadership that's reflective of racial diversity, changing the culture to accept the culture of different racial groups. These are things that are important, but I think they speak to what's important to our larger society. So if we want to learn how to overcome racial division, we got to include everyone in the conversation. We got to be willing to make adjustments for everyone in the conversation. So the way in which we can have success is not that we go in and say, here's our group, here's what we need, you have to give us what we need. And we don't have to listen to you. The way we're going to have success is our group has this needs, your group has that needs. What can we get? How can we give and take so that we can work together? How can I hear you? How can you hear me? Because those are things that's going to get us through this racial moment. Fighting one another is not.
Yeah. And isn't that what we see, Dr. Yancey, in Acts chapter 6, when among the disciples and the growing church early on, there was a charge that has a racial tint to it. The Hellenistic Jews complained that they were being overlooked by the Hebrew Jews. Both were Jewish in their faith, but ethnically Aramaic and Hellenistic. And the solution was they listened, they prayerfully made a decision, they empowered leaders from a Greek background. I think that's so important that we learn from the church just what you're saying, how to have those conversations and to say, this is what our group wants, therefore give us that. Now, how do we have this conversation together?
Yeah, I think it's vital to learn how to have a conversation together. I don't think we're going to be able to get past this until we do it. And that's an example that I do use in my new book, because I do think the Bible actually shows how you deal with conflict within the church, is that, that people try to figure out how can we meet the needs. And in the end, everyone's needs got met because they were able to figure it out.
Well, and actually the church grew. Not only were the needs met of the widows, the church grew. And after that, it says a number of priests became obedient to the faith. And when you think about the evidence of a Jewish priest, which would mean leaving his position and his income to become a follower of Jesus, that says about what the impact can be in a healthy, gospel-centered, multi-ethnic community.
Yeah.
You made a statement here. Research suggests that a common identity and fruitful interracial contact can reduce prejudice. And I know that's what you were alluding to earlier there, but the identity in Christ, I think that, would you agree that that's the identity that we start with, our identity in Christ?
I agree that in the church, that identity, if we take it seriously, can help to reduce the bias we have toward one another. The research isn't limited to religious identity. I just want to be clear about that. that a lot of overarching identities can have that effect, but we have access to it through the church.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, some of the other areas which I think would be interesting that I've noticed that you write about are is there bias against Christians in America, and I'm probably saying the word wrong, but Christianophobia. Maybe I know you've written on that. Can you talk to us just a little bit about some of that work?
Yeah, a few years ago I did some research on anti-Christian bias, Christianophobia, and I used a data set, a national data set, to get some quantitative work to sort of show the degree to which there's animosity towards Christians. And then I also had some qualitative work from open-ended questions I gotten from people who are cultural progressive activists. And so, there is this bias. It's the animosity towards Christians in the United States, and by the Christians, I mean conservative Christians, is probably as strong as animosity towards Muslims.
Yeah.
But who has the animosity, it differs. Whereas the people with animosity towards Muslims tend to be white males who are poorly educated and not very wealthy. Those with animosity towards Christians tend to be white males who are highly educated and have a great deal of money. So the way it manifests itself is going to be different. If you don't have a lot of resources, you're going to probably manifest animosity in violent ways. And so Muslims are more subject to violence than Christians are. But if you're wealthy and powerful, that animosity can come out in, who gets jobs, who gets, how our culture portrays religious others, and that sort of thing. And so I'm not making an argument that fundamentalist Christians have it worse than Muslims in the United States. I'm saying that their problems are different, and there's at least some reason to believe that the animosity they face could be as pernicious as the animosity Muslims face, but not as violent, because that's less likely to happen. If you have education and money, you're probably not going to go beat someone up, but you could get them fired. So, so there's that to consider.
What led you into this line of work? Just curious.
Sociology in general, you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
When I went to grad school, I was in economics, and I took a sociology of family class, and I found it fascinating. I asked some questions about divorce effects and such, and so I said, well, if I go for a doctorate, I want to in sociology, not economics, and that's what happened.
Wow. Dr. Yancey, do you have a website or a place where people who want to read more of your writings or books, do you have a website?
Yeah, I do. It's georgeyancey.com. Yancey spelled Yancey. And yeah, you can learn more about what I've written or contact me through that.
So the book Beyond Racial Division is coming out, my understanding, in March of
March 15th.
March 15th.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, either book I recommend our folks at Journey and those watching us. Beyond Racial Gridlock, wonderful book written in 2006. And then the new book, Beyond Racial Division. And if you go to georgeyancey.com, you'll see a lot of other writings on some really, at least to me, fascinating subjects that are relevant to so many of us who follow Jesus, particularly in America. So, Dr. Yancey, I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And appreciate you being with us on Midweek Conversations.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today in what I believe is a very important midweek conversation, and just the conversation that I had with Dr. George Yancey. I'm so grateful that he took the time. He is a distinguished scholar on a lot of subjects. He really is an expert on a lot of these subjects that are really relevant to what it means to be a Christian in America and some of the challenges that we deal with. So I encourage you that to go to his website, as he mentioned, georgeyancey.com. Might want to check out that book that gets released in March of 2022 called Beyond Racial Division. and just hear a very balanced and I think biblically accurate perspective of how we can be that church on earth that more mirrors what the church is going to look like in heaven. This week is Super Bowl Sunday. Pretty exciting about that. My home, the team that I grew up cheering for, the Cincinnati Bengals, Houday, are in the Super Bowl this Sunday. I'm very excited about that, and so I'm pulling for the Bengals. Pastor Dustin is going to share kind of a special message with us based on the whole Super Bowl Sunday idea, and I'm looking forward to that. I hope you join us 9:30 and 11:15 on site or online, and we're always on mission, and we are always loving the journey.